The fastest way to discover who someone truly is to watch how they treat the person they believe has nothing to offer. On a cold Thursday evening in Manhattan, when the city shimmered beneath thousands of lights and luxury cars lined the curb outside Hawthorne House, one sentence drifted through the elegant dining room and silenced every conversation within earshot. Know your place. Ethan Blackwood didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. At 39, the billionaire founder of Blackwood Capital had spent years mastering the art of making a room obey him with nothing more than a calm expression and a carefully chosen sentence. His charcoal suit fit with effortless precision. A Swiss watch rested beneath his cuff, catching the glow of crystal chandeliers every time he moved his wrist. Investors admired him. Competitors feared him. Employees rarely questioned him. Across from him stood Claire Whitmore, balancing a polished serving tray with steady hands. Her crisp white shirt and black apron blended into the restaurant's carefully designed elegance. Yet there was something about her that didn't disappear into the background. Maybe it was the quiet confidence in her posture. Maybe it was the unusual calm in her pale blue eyes. Or maybe it was the simple fact that she looked directly at people instead of through them. Just moments earlier, she had politely explained that another guest's medical dietary request required the kitchen to adjust the timing of several orders, including Mr. Blackwood's perfectly prepared filet. The delay would be 6 minutes. Not 10, not 20, just 6. For most people, that explanation would have been enough. For Ethan Blackwood, it felt like an inconvenience no one should dare place in front of him. He slowly looked up from the financial report glowing on his phone, set it beside his untouched glass of sparkling water, and met Claire's eyes with practiced indifference. "Know your place," he said quietly. "My dinner comes before excuses." The words floated across the dining room like cold winter air. Silverware stopped moving. A couple celebrating an anniversary lowered their glasses. Even the pianist near the grand staircase seemed to hesitate for half a heartbeat before continuing the melody. Claire remained perfectly still. No argument crossed her lips. No embarrassment reached her face. She simply nodded once with the same professional courtesy she had shown every customer that evening. "Your dinner will be served as soon as it's ready, Mr. Blackwood," she answered gently. "Thank you for your patience." Patience. The word almost sounded like a gift instead of correction. Ethan watched her walk away with measured steps, expecting frustration, anger, perhaps even tears once she reached the service station. Instead, she thanked another guest for waiting, smiled warmly at an elderly couple celebrating their 50th anniversary, and knelt beside a little boy to replace the straw he had accidentally dropped without making him feel embarrassed. Nothing about her changed. It was as if his words had never touched her. Ethan frowned without realizing it. People usually reacted. They apologized too much, defended themselves, or tried desperately to impress him. Claire Whitmore had done none of those things. She simply continued treating every person in the restaurant exactly the same. Around the room, whispers quietly began replacing conversations. Some pitted the waitress. Others quietly criticized the billionaire. No one realized they were witnessing the first move in a story that would leave every person inside Hawthorne House questioning what success really looked like before the night was over. Claire Whitmore had learned years ago that silence often revealed more than arguments ever could. While whispers continued drifting across the dining room behind her, she disappeared through the swinging kitchen doors with the same graceful pace she had maintained since the beginning of her shift. Stainless steel counters reflected warm overhead lights as chefs called out orders with practiced precision. Plates moved from station to station like pieces of an orchestra performing without sheet music. Claire picked up a freshly prepared salmon entree, checked the garnish with careful attention, and quietly thanked the line cook before delivering another table's dinner. Every movement seemed deliberate. Every smile felt genuine. Nothing about her suggested someone who had just been publicly embarrassed. Marcus Delgado, the restaurant manager, approached with concern written across his face. He lowered his voice. "Claire, are you all right?" She looked up with a calm smile that surprised him. "Of course. Table 14 still needs their wine pairing. and table 6 asked for another basket of bread. Marcus studied her for a moment before nodding slowly. During the 3 years she had worked at Hawthorne House, he had never once seen her lose her composure. Not when customers complained. Not when a busy Saturday night overwhelmed the kitchen. Not even when a power outage had forced the entire staff to serve hundreds of guests by candlelight. There was something unusually steady about her, something impossible to teach. The newest servers often came to Claire for advice, because she never corrected anyone with criticism. She simply showed them a better way through quiet example. A young waiter accidentally dropped a polished fork while rushing toward table. Before embarrassment could reach his face, Claire bent down, picked it up, exchanged it for a clean one, and whispered, "Slow is smooth. Smooth becomes fast." The young man smiled with relief and thanked her before continuing his shift with renewed confidence. Across the dining room, Ethan Blackwood noticed the exchange without understanding why it held his attention. He had expected resentment after their encounter. Instead, Claire moved through the restaurant as though every guest deserved equal kindness. Whether serving a billionaire discussing acquisitions or an elderly couple splitting one dessert to celebrate 50 years together, her voice never changed. Her respect never fluctuated. She carried herself with the same quiet dignity regardless of who sat at the table. That detail unsettled Ethan more than he cared to admit. His assistant, Daniel Foster, glanced up from reviewing presentation notes. "Should I ask them to prioritize your order?" Ethan barely looked away from Claire. "No." Daniel blinked in surprise. Normally his employer tolerated no delays. Tonight, however, something had interrupted Ethan's usual certainty. It was not guilt. At least that was what he told himself. It was curiosity. Who remained that composed after being spoken to the way he had spoken to her? Near the front entrance, a little girl accidentally let go of her father's hand while chasing a folded paper napkin that had floated toward the revolving door. Before anyone else reacted, Claire gently stepped into the child's path, knelt to one knee, retrieved the napkin, and handed it back with a warm smile. The little girl giggled before running safely back to her grateful father. Several nearby diners smiled at the simple moment. Claire never looked around to see whether anyone had noticed. She simply returned to work as though kindness required no audience. Ethan watched the entire exchange in silence. For the first time that evening, he realized he could remember the expensive watch on his wrist, the market numbers on his phone, and the value of every company represented around his table. Yet he knew absolutely nothing about the woman everyone else seemed to trust without hesitation. And somewhere beneath the polished confidence that had carried him through every boardroom in America, the first small crack quietly appeared. Ethan Blackwood had built his empire on one simple belief. Every person revealed their value eventually. Some revealed it through numbers, others through negotiation. Most revealed at the moment pressure entered the room. Since the age of 26, he had transformed a struggling investment firm into one of the most influential financial companies in the country. Business magazines called him disciplined. Television anchors called him brilliant. His competitors preferred another word: relentless. He rarely lost a negotiation because he never allowed emotion to cloud his judgment. Every meeting became a calculation. Every conversation had a purpose. Every relationship existed inside carefully measured boundaries. His closest advisors often joked that Ethan could calculate risk faster than most people could calculate a restaurant tip. They laughed. Ethan never did. Success had taught him that hesitation cost money. Compassion often clouded decisions. Efficiency always won. At least that was the philosophy that had guided every major decision of his career. Across the polished walnut table sat Daniel Foster, his executive assistant for nearly 8 years. Daniel had witnessed billion-dollar acquisitions, emergency board meetings, and countless high-pressure negotiations. He recognized the subtle signs that others missed. Tonight, something was different. Ethan had barely glanced at the quarterly projections displayed on his tablet for almost 5 minutes. That had never happened before. "The Boston conference begins at 9 tomorrow morning," Daniel reminded him quietly. The board also expects your final recommendation before midnight. Ethan nodded without looking away from the dining room. I know. Daniel followed his employer's line of sight until he realized exactly where Ethan's attention rested. Claire Whitmore was serving another table with the same composed professionalism she had shown throughout the evening. Interesting waitress, Daniel said carefully. Ethan answered after a brief silence. She does not react the way people usually do. Daniel smiled slightly. Maybe because she is working. Ethan leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together. No, it is more than that. His voice remained calm, but his thoughts refused to settle. He replayed the brief exchange again. Most people who encountered him either tried to impress him or avoided disappointing him. Claire had done neither. She simply treated him like another customer. Not an ordinary man, not an extraordinary one. Simply another human being occupying another table. That realization irritated him far more than he expected. Nearby, two younger entrepreneurs who recognized Ethan whispered excitedly while pretending not to stare. One quietly admired the billionaire's confidence. The other admitted he thought the waitress had handled the situation with remarkable grace. Their conversation drifted only a few feet before disappearing beneath soft piano music. Ethan heard enough to understand that people had noticed. Public perception had never mattered much to him, but respect did. He believed respect was earned through achievement. Yet somehow Claire seemed to command it without displaying wealth, authority, or influence. Marcus Delgado approached Ethan's table, carrying the long-delayed entree himself. "Thank you for your patience, Mr. Blackwood," he said politely. "We appreciate your understanding." Ethan glanced toward the kitchen entrance. "Where is your waitress?" Marcus hesitated before answering. "She is helping another guest, sir." Ethan looked across the room and saw Claire sitting beside an elderly woman whose hands trembled slightly while trying to read the menu beneath the dim evening lights. Claire was not rushing. She patiently described each dish until the woman smiled with visible relief before placing her order. When Claire stood, the woman gently squeezed her hand in gratitude. No cameras recorded the moment. No applause followed. Kindness simply happened quietly as though it belonged there. Ethan found himself watching longer than he intended. Numbers had always explained the world to him. Profit margins, stock prices, market trends. Tonight, however, none of those measurements explained why one waitress seemed to possess a kind of influence that money could not purchase. For the first time in years, the billionaire who believed he understood people realized he might have completely misunderstood the strongest person in the room. Claire returned to Ethan's table carrying his dinner with the same composed expression she had worn all evening. The filet rested perfectly centered on a warm porcelain plate, accompanied by roasted asparagus and rosemary potatoes arranged with quiet precision. She gently placed the entree before him and stepped back. "Thank you for waiting, Mr. Blackwood." The chef wanted to ensure everything met the restaurant standards. Ethan looked down briefly before lifting his eyes to hers. Standards are expensive. Claire offered a courteous smile. So is trust. For the first time that evening, Ethan almost smiled. Almost. Daniel noticed the subtle change immediately, but remained silent. Claire turned to leave when Ethan spoke again. "One moment." She stopped. "Yes, sir." He leaned back comfortably, folding his napkin across his lap. "Since everyone here seems to admire your professionalism, perhaps you can settle something for me." Several nearby diners glanced toward the table without appearing obvious. Ethan's voice remained calm enough that nobody could accuse him of causing a scene, yet every sentence carried the unmistakable confidence of someone accustomed to controlling conversations. "If a customer pays premium prices," he continued, "should the customer receive premium treatment above everyone else?" Claire considered the question for only a second. Every guest deserves excellent service. Ethan tilted his head slightly. "That was not my question. It was my answer." Daniel quietly shifted in his chair. He had seen this pattern before. Ethan was testing someone. Board members, lawyers, executives, potential partners. He enjoyed presenting questions that had no comfortable response. Usually the other person became defensive within moments. Claire remained completely relaxed. Ethan picked up his fork, but did not begin eating. Let's try again. Suppose one customer spends $10,000 here every month, while another only visits once a year for an anniversary dinner. Which customer matters more to the restaurant? Claire looked around the dining room before answering. Candlelight reflected softly across polished glasses. Couples laughed quietly. Families celebrated birthdays. Friends reunited after long months apart. The one creating the memory they will never forget, she replied. Ethan looked at her with genuine curiosity. That is not measurable. Not everything valuable is. A soft silence settled between them. Daniel looked down at his notes, pretending to organize papers while secretly listening. At a nearby table, two business consultants exchanged quick glances. One whispered that the waitress was remarkably confident. The other simply nodded. Ethan rested his fork on the edge of the plate. Confidence is unusual in your profession. Claire answered without hesitation. Respect should not depend on a profession. The words were gentle. There was no accusation hiding inside them. No sarcasm, only simple honesty. Ethan noticed something unexpected. She never tried to embarrass him. She never attempted to win the conversation. She merely answered every question as though they were discussing the weather instead of pride. Marcus Delgado observed the exchange from the service station, growing increasingly nervous. He trusted Claire completely, yet he also understood the influence sitting at table 12. One negative review from Ethan Blackwood could damage the restaurant's reputation overnight. Marcus started walking toward them, intending to intervene if necessary. Before he reached the table, Claire quietly excused herself to refill another guest's coffee without waiting for permission or approval. She simply returned to serving the room. Ethan watched her disappear between the tables once again. He realized she had never once reacted to his status. She had never flattered him, never challenged him for attention, never seemed intimidated by his wealth. She had answered every question with the same calm sincerity she offered every other guest. Daniel finally broke the silence. You keep testing her. Ethan slowly cut into his dinner, though his thoughts remained elsewhere. No, he said quietly. I think I'm beginning to realize that I might be the one being tested. The evening continued with the familiar rhythm of polished glasses, quiet conversations, and soft piano music floating beneath the crystal chandeliers, but something subtle had changed inside Hawthorne House. More guests were watching Claire than before, although most of them could not explain why. She moved through the dining room with effortless composure, never rushing yet never falling behind, greeting every table with the same warm professionalism that had quietly become part of the restaurant's identity. Ethan finished several bites of his dinner before realizing it was one of the finest meals he had eaten in months. Ironically, the 6-minute delay he had considered unacceptable had produced a meal prepared with remarkable care. He glanced toward the open kitchen where chefs coordinated each order with practiced precision. Then his attention returned to Claire just as the front doors opened once again. An older gentleman stepped inside, carrying himself with the calm confidence of someone who had spent decades earning respect rather than demanding it. His silver hair was neatly combed. His navy overcoat rested across one arm, and although he wore no extravagant jewelry, several guests immediately recognized him. William Ashcroft, founder of Ashcroft Publishing, a philanthropist known throughout New York for funding literacy programs and university scholarships. Marcus Delgado hurried forward to greet him personally. Good evening, Mr. Ashcroft. Your usual table is ready. Before Marcus could escort him across the dining room, William's eyes settled on Claire. His expression changed instantly. Genuine surprise softened into unmistakable warmth. Claire, he said with quiet disbelief. Several heads turned. Claire looked up from arranging fresh coffee cups and smiled with sincere affection. Good evening, Mr. Ashcroft. It has been a while. Instead of allowing the manager to continue, William walked directly toward her. To the astonishment of nearby guests, he extended both hands with visible respect. I cannot believe it is really you. Claire laughed softly. I have been here for quite some time, and nobody thought to tell me. William asked, shaking his head with a smile. The last time I saw you, you were giving a lecture that left an entire auditorium taking notes for 10 straight minutes. Claire gently lowered her eyes. That feels like another lifetime. Ethan slowly placed his knife beside his plate. Daniel looked up immediately. Neither man spoke. William continued with unmistakable admiration. Some of the young entrepreneurs I mentor still quote your ideas about leadership. They have no idea where those lessons came from. Claire answered with the same quiet humility she had shown everyone else that evening. People remember ideas better than names. That has always been enough for me. William smiled. Only you would say something like that. Marcus stood frozen beside them. He had managed a restaurant for years and had never heard Claire mention giving lectures, mentoring executives, or speaking before large audiences. Around the room, curious whispers began replacing ordinary conversation once again. Ethan found himself studying Claire with a completely different perspective. Nothing about her expression suggested pride. She did not introduce herself. She did not explain her past. She did not encourage the attention. In fact, she seemed almost uncomfortable becoming the center of the room. William noticed her hesitation and lowered his voice. Forgive me. I did not mean to interrupt your work. Claire smiled warmly. You never interrupted anything important. William nodded with quiet respect before allowing Marcus to escort him to his table, but not before saying one final sentence that drifted farther than he intended. Some people teach from a stage, Claire. Others teach simply by the way they live. Ethan heard every word. For the first time since entering Hawthorne House, certainty abandoned him completely. The woman he had dismissed as ordinary was beginning to look like the only person in the room who had never needed wealth or status to earn admiration. William Ashcroft had barely settled into his chair when another familiar face entered the restaurant. This time the atmosphere shifted for an entirely different reason. 3 sharply dressed executives stepped inside, speaking in low, urgent voices while carrying leather portfolios and tablet computers. Their expressions revealed the kind of pressure that usually existed only behind the closed doors of corporate boardrooms. Marcus recognized one of them immediately and welcomed the group with practiced hospitality. As they passed Ethan's table, the tallest executive paused. Mr. Blackwood, I did not expect to see you here. Ethan rose politely and shook his hand. Richard, good evening. Richard Collins served as chief legal counsel for one of the largest manufacturing companies on the East Coast. His team had spent months negotiating a strategic partnership with an international supplier, and Ethan knew they were approaching the final stages of a deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Richard forced a tired smile. We were supposed to celebrate tonight after receiving the final contract revisions. Instead, we just discovered that one paragraph changes the entire liability structure. The frustration in his voice was impossible to miss. Our attorneys cannot agree on the interpretation, and the overseas team insists their wording is correct. Ethan frowned slightly. Can it wait until morning? Richard slowly shook his head. The signing deadline expires at midnight. If we misunderstand the language, the financial exposure could become enormous. If we delay, the supplier walks away. Daniel quietly looked toward Ethan. Opportunities like this often demanded immediate attention. Ethan stood from his chair and walked a few steps toward Richard's table, where several printed documents lay spread across polished linen beside untouched coffee cups. The executives spoke rapidly, pointing to highlighted paragraphs and handwritten notes. Their frustration grew with every passing minute. Several guests noticed the tension but respectfully returned to their own conversations. Across the room, Claire continued serving desserts without appearing distracted, although she quietly observed the gathering from a distance. She recognized the unmistakable look of people trying very hard to solve the wrong problem. Ethan studied the contract for several moments before speaking. The wording is unusual. Richard sighed. Exactly. Every sentence appears correct on its own, but together they create conflicting obligations. Daniel leaned closer. Perhaps another legal review tomorrow. Richard gave a discouraged smile. Tomorrow will be too late. A brief silence settled over the table. Claire approached, carrying fresh coffee for the executives. carefully placing each cup beside its owner without interrupting the discussion. As she reached for the empty coffee pot, her eyes briefly passed across the highlighted paragraph. She said nothing. She simply noticed a familiar pattern hidden beneath the formal language. Richard thanked her absent-mindedly before returning to the debate. Claire took one step away, then paused almost imperceptibly. She turned back with the same respectful tone she used for every guest. "Please forgive the interruption," she said softly. "I could be mistaken." Every conversation around the table stopped. Ethan slowly looked up. Richard blinked with polite surprise. Claire continued carefully. "But I do not believe the disagreement is actually about liability." Richard exchanged confused glances with his colleagues. "What do you mean?" Claire gently pointed toward one sentence without touching the document. "The definition on page 2 changes the meaning of every paragraph that follows. If you read this section first instead of beginning with the financial clauses, the apparent conflict disappears." Complete silence followed. Ethan looked down at the contract once more. Then he slowly turned back to page 2, exactly where Claire had indicated. Within seconds, the confident certainty he had carried throughout the evening gave way to something far less familiar. Genuine astonishment. Richard adjusted his glasses and silently reread the contract from the beginning exactly as Claire had suggested. The room seemed to shrink around the table as every executive leaned closer, following each sentence with renewed attention. 20 seconds passed, then 30. Finally, Richard exhaled slowly and rested his hand against the polished wood. "She is right." One of his associates immediately flipped through the remaining pages, tracing the cross-references with a pen. His eyebrows lifted higher with every paragraph. "The liability clause only appears contradictory because we skipped the revised definitions section." Another attorney nodded in disbelief. "The overseas legal team changed the sequence instead of the language. We have been arguing about the wrong issue for nearly 2 hours." Ethan looked from the contract to Claire, who still stood quietly beside the table, holding an empty coffee pot as though nothing remarkable had happened. She did not smile with satisfaction. She did not appear eager to explain further. She simply waited to see whether they needed anything else. Richard slowly stood from his chair. "Miss Whitmore," he said with sincere respect, "may I ask where you learned to read corporate contracts like this?" Claire answered with the same gentle tone she had used all evening. "A long time ago, I reviewed enough agreements to learn that definitions usually matter, more than conclusions." Richard gave a soft laugh, filled with amazement. "That is something I tell first-year associates, not something I expect to hear from someone serving coffee." Claire offered a modest smile. "Good documents reward careful readers." William Ashcroft looked over from his nearby table and smiled knowingly, as though none of this surprised him. Ethan remained unusually quiet. His mind replayed every moment since he had entered the restaurant. Every assumption he had made now seemed embarrassingly incomplete. Richard hesitated before asking another question. "Were you ever an attorney?" Claire gently shook her head. "No." "Then a corporate consultant?" She smiled again. "Closer." Richard waited patiently. Claire lowered her eyes for a brief moment before answering. "I spent several years teaching executive leadership and business strategy. Part of that work involved helping companies understand contracts before negotiations reached the legal stage." Complete silence settled across the dining room once again. Even Marcus, standing several feet away, stared in open disbelief. Daniel looked at Ethan with an expression he had never worn during 8 years of working together. "Salt?" Richard blinked twice. "You taught executives?" Claire nodded once. "Until my mother became seriously ill. After she passed away, I decided I needed a different pace for a while." She said it without sadness or self-pity. It sounded like someone calmly describing the weather. "This restaurant gave me steady work and kind people. I stayed longer than I expected." William Ashcroft raised his coffee cup from across the room. "She is being modest," he called with a warm smile. Claire was one of the most respected leadership speakers I ever invited to our foundation. Fortune 500 executives filled entire conference halls to hear her speak about trust, humility, and long-term decision-making. Several guests exchanged astonished glances. One businessman quietly searched her name on his phone before freezing at the first result he found. Ethan noticed the change in his expression. Whatever appeared on that screen confirmed everything William had just said. Claire, however, paid no attention to any of it. She simply picked up the coffee pot once more. "Would anyone like a refill?" she asked politely. The simplicity of the question somehow carried more dignity than every title mentioned during the conversation. Ethan looked at the woman he had judged within seconds of meeting her and realized that her greatest accomplishment was not the career she had left behind. It was the extraordinary grace with which she carried herself after no longer needing anyone to recognize it. No one spoke for several long seconds. The gentle notes of the piano returned to filling the room, but now they sounded different, softer somehow, as though even the music understood that something meaningful had just happened. Ethan Blackwood slowly pushed his chair back and stood. The movement was quiet, yet every conversation in the restaurant faded almost instantly. People recognized him. They expected another display of authority, another confident explanation that would restore the balance they believed always favored the powerful. Instead, Ethan looked directly at Claire with an expression no one at Hawthorne House had seen before. It was neither frustration nor calculation. It was humility. Claire had already turned toward the service station, preparing to continue her evening as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. "Miss Whitmore." His voice stopped her before she reached the kitchen doors. She turned with the same calm smile she had offered him from the beginning of the evening. "Yes, Mr. Blackwood." Ethan took several measured steps until they stood only a few feet apart. Daniel remained frozen beside the table. Richard Collins lowered his coffee cup. William Ashcroft watched quietly without saying a word. Every eye in the dining room followed the moment unfolding beneath the warm chandelier light. Ethan inhaled slowly before speaking. "Earlier this evening, I believed your uniform told me everything I needed to know about you." Claire remained silent. "I judged your value before I knew your name. I assumed my position entitled me to speak without considering the person standing in front of me." His voice stayed steady, but each sentence seemed heavier than the one before it. "I was wrong." The words landed gently across the dining room. They did not sound rehearsed. They sounded earned. Ethan continued, "I have spent years building companies, negotiating contracts, and measuring success through numbers. Tonight you reminded me that character cannot be measured on a balance sheet." Claire looked at him with quiet kindness rather than triumph. She did not appear interested in hearing an apology because she had never been seeking one. Ethan lowered his head slightly. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was something much rarer, genuine respect. "I owe you an apology, Miss Whitmore. Not because you proved me wrong, but because I never gave you the dignity you deserve in the first place." The silence that followed felt almost sacred. Claire answered softly, "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. Nothing more. No lecture. No reminder of his earlier words. No attempt to make the moment larger than it already was." Ethan blinked with quiet surprise. "That is all." Claire smiled warmly. "People grow when they are willing to admit they were mistaken. That deserves encouragement, not punishment." William Ashcroft quietly smiled into his coffee. Richard Collins nodded almost imperceptibly. Daniel looked at his employer with newfound admiration. Ethan gave a faint smile that reached his eyes for the first time that evening. "You teach even when you are not standing in front of an audience." Claire glanced around the dining room, where several guests waited patiently for dessert, fresh coffee, and the simple comforts that had brought them there in the first place. "Some lessons belong in conference halls," she replied. "Others belong in ordinary moments." She excused herself politely and walked toward an elderly couple waiting for another pot of tea. Within seconds, she was once again adjusting silverware, refilling glasses, and asking whether everything tasted as expected. Nothing about her pace changed. Nothing about her posture suggested she had just become the center of the entire restaurant. Ethan watched her disappear into the quiet rhythm of service and finally understood the difference between influence and importance. Influence demanded attention. True importance never asked for it. And somewhere between a delayed dinner, a simple contract, and a waitress who never forgot the humanity of the people around her. The billionaire discovered that the person who had truly found her place was the one who had never needed anyone else's permission to stand there. The dinner service slowly returned to its familiar rhythm, yet no one inside Hawthorne House would remember the evening because of the menu or the elegant decor. They would remember the quiet waitress who never asked anyone to recognize her, and the billionaire who discovered that genuine respect could not be purchased, negotiated, or demanded. Claire continued moving from table to table with the same gentle professionalism that had defined her entire shift. She refilled coffee for William Ashcroft, wished a young couple a happy anniversary, wrapped a slice of cheesecake for an elderly gentleman to take home to his wife, and thanked each guest with the same sincere smile. Nothing about her behavior suggested that she had just become the most talked-about person in the restaurant. Marcus Delgado approached her near the service station after the last dinner orders had been delivered. He shook his head with an expression that mixed admiration with disbelief. "Claire," he said softly, "I have worked beside you for 3 years. Why did you never tell any of us who you were?" She carefully folded a clean linen napkin before placing it beside a stack of polished silverware. "Because I wanted to be accepted for who I am today, not for what I used to do." Marcus looked at her quietly. "But people would have treated you differently." Claire nodded with a peaceful smile. "Exactly." A few feet away, Ethan was preparing to leave when Daniel handed him his coat. For the first time in years, Ethan ignored the stream of business notifications lighting up his phone. None of them felt as urgent as the lesson he had just received without stepping inside a boardroom. Before walking toward the exit, he quietly asked Marcus one final question. "Is she happy here?" Marcus smiled. "Every morning, she says she is grateful to have honest work, kind coworkers, and another chance to make someone's day a little better. I have never heard her complain." Ethan looked across the dining room one last time. Claire was helping a young busser learn the proper way to arrange a table for the next guests, encouraging him with patience instead of criticism. The young employee smiled with growing confidence after every quiet instruction she offered. Ethan realized she had been leading people all evening without anyone noticing. Not through authority, not through titles, simply through example. He walked toward Claire and placed a neatly folded check presenter on the counter beside her. "Thank you for dinner," he said. Claire smiled warmly. "You are very welcome, Mr. Blackwood. I hope everything met your expectations." Ethan looked at her for a moment before answering. "No." Claire raised an eyebrow with gentle curiosity. A small smile appeared on Ethan's face. It exceeded them in every way that mattered. With that, he wished her a pleasant evening and walked out into the cool Manhattan night. Claire waited until the doors quietly closed behind him before opening the check presenter. Inside rested a generous gratuity, but what caught her attention was not the amount. It was a handwritten note resting beneath the receipt. In neat, careful handwriting, Ethan had written only one sentence. "Thank you for reminding me that every person deserves to be seen before they are judged." Claire folded the note, slipped it into her apron pocket, and returned to polishing the last wine glass of the evening. Outside, the city continued rushing toward tomorrow, filled with people chasing titles, promotions, recognition, and success. Inside Hawthorne House, one quiet lesson lingered long after the final guest had gone home. Clothes can introduce a profession. Wealth can introduce achievement. Titles can introduce status. But only character introduces the person. And the people who never need to announce their worth are often the ones the world remembers the longest.